choice of platforms.
Oh,
Wish we had more choice than we have currently.
Yeah.
So want to say hi to everybody. It's been a while since we've had an Educational Freedom Institute podcast. There's a lot going on in the world of education reform and in the world more generally. I'm Corey DeAngelis, co-hosting this podcast with Matthew Nielsen, who is the co-founder of the Educational Freedom Institute and the current president of the board of the Educational Freedom Institute. We have a great special guest with us today, Ryan Petty. He is the founder of Walkup for Schools, which is an advocacy group for preventative measures for safer schools. And he is also an advocate for school safety at the national level and then also in Parkland in Florida. So thanks for coming out here with us, Ryan. It's good to talk to you.
Well, it's great to be on podcast finally. I've been a long-time viewer, first-time participant, but good to be on with you, Corey and Matthew, today.
Yeah, so I gave a quick little introduction, but could you give us a more in-depth introduction? What got you interested in school safety reform, and tell us a little bit about your organization, Walkup for Schools, and then also Stand with Parkland, which you're also a part of as well.
Yeah, so this is the hard part. So how did I get involved in all of this? Well, unfortunately, I got involved in school safety advocacy, not by choice, but because I wasn't involved more as a parent, I think, before in understanding what was going on in our schools. My daughter, Elena, was 14 and was one of the victims that was killed in the Parkland Marjory Stoneman Douglas shooting. And worst day of my life. And it's hard to think about it. It's hard to talk about it. We're now almost 3 years out, and thinking back on the events of that day, I still struggle for the words. But on a more positive note, I guess my advocacy has really centered around what I learned about why that tragedy occurred, what happened in the events preceding that, and what could have been done to prevent it. And so I was asked by our former governor, Rick Scott, or I was appointed. I wasn't asked. He asked me first, but then he appointed me to the Marjory Stoneman Douglas Public Safety Commission. We were charged with investigating the tragedy. And it was a group of fathers, of victims, law enforcement, educators, mental health professionals, and others, really good people across the state of Florida that got together. We had all the authority and power from the state legislature that we needed. We could subpoena witnesses. It was a complete law enforcement backed, legislature and governor backed group. And we brought folks in. And we got to the bottom of what happened and why it happened, more importantly. And from that, from learning about it, that's really what informed my advocacy. What I learned was the initial reaction to the tragedy and the calls for things like restricting Second Amendment freedoms, gun rights. That whole media narrative that came out of Parkland was wrong. It was wrong-headed. It was wrong thinking. It would not have prevented the tragedy that day, and it would not prevent most of these school tragedies, unfortunately. And so I shifted into understanding what could we do to prevent these things from happening in the first place. And really, what I learned was the Secret Service does a pretty good job of preventing attacks on our elected officials, notwithstanding, the events of this past week and some of the concerns about what happened at the Capitol and the effectiveness of law enforcement there. But they've done a very good job of protecting the president. And what I learned from them is that they've created what's called a behavioral threat assessment model. And they actually go out. So if you make a threat against the president, you're going to get a visit. You're going to get a visit from some Secret Service agents. And rather than going there to arrest you, they're going to talk to you. They're going to try to figure out what's going on in your life. Why did you make the threat? What is happening in your life that precipitated you making a threat? and they're going to get to the bottom of that. And then they're going to bring resources in to try to figure out how to help you. And a lot of times, there's some triggering event. It's more than you had a bad day, but maybe you had a bad year. And maybe things are just not going the way you think they should in life, and you get wrapped up into politics and you decide to make a threat against the president. Well, they're going to come in and help unwind that. And they view that preventative work that they do, that interviewing that they do of those that make threats, that understanding what's going on in their life and fixing the problems that precipitated the threat. They view that as every bit important as all the fancy stuff that we see and don't see that they do to protect the White House and the president. They think it's as valuable as the limo. I think what's that called, the beast that they have, right? And all the armaments and other things that and technology that they have to protect the president. They view this preventative work as just as important. And so, in short, what I learned was most of these tragedies, in fact, almost all of them, there were warning signs that were transmitted by these attackers, and these attackers let somebody else know. And that information was not passed on to those that could have done something about it. What was so difficult to learn about our tragedy at Parkland was that a lot of those things did happen. There were warning signs. They were transmitted to the FBI, to the school district, to law enforcement, and they didn't act. Or what they did in acting was insufficient to stop it. And so that sort of adds salt to the wounds. As a father whose daughter was just there to sitting in English class in the morning and just like any other day. And so whatever I can do to stop it or prevent it, that's what I'm going to focus on.
So, and this is what gets us into the Walkup Foundation, right? And what are some specifics of what this looks like on the ground? Is it only for things that are being pushed for public schools? Is it only in Florida? Is this a nationwide thing? Can it be used for private schools? What's the main idea of the push going forward?
Yeah, this model. So so the organization, sort of what we started as and what we're doing today, has morphed a little bit. We spend most of our time sort of advocating at the state and national level for school districts and communities to adopt this behavioral threat assessment model. It's not difficult to do. In fact, in the state of Florida, our governor and legislature have mandated it. So every state agency is trained on behavioral threat assessment, not just our schools. In Florida, we have an Office of Safe Schools. It's responsible for driving this within our districts. Every district has a school safety director that's responsible for implementing behavioral threat assessment, putting the training in place, and making sure that it's done with some level of fidelity. Now, it's like anything else. There's a lot of room for error in that, right? Florida's a big state, 67 school districts, millions of students, lots of chances for things to break and go wrong. And so it's never going to be 100% perfect. But what we're trying to do at the Walkup Foundation is make sure that we're trying to drive awareness of behavioral threat assessment as an option, as a tool. We're trying to make sure that folks are not creating information silos and that information is freely shared. And we're trying to make sure that whether you're a public school or private school, even a business, even malls and shopping centers can use behavioral threat assessment models to better understand, working with local law enforcement to better understand threats that might be that they might be subject to. And so it works everywhere. It works very well, and we're just trying to drive advocacy there.
Go ahead, Matthew.
Yeah, so the main idea, Ryan, is, and correct me if I'm wrong, but this is how I'm understanding it. And I jumped on your website a while ago to try to get my mind wrapped around behavioral threat assessment and what it is that you're advocating for. But the general idea is that if you catch these people early, by using those techniques and those methods that have been, that, like you mentioned, Secret Service, you mentioned in Virginia, they've been using this model. If you catch those early, then things like we see around the country, things like you experience firsthand, we can catch those and prevent them from happening. It's a preventative measure versus a responsive measure.
100%.
Getting that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Matthew. And the idea is that when you go back and study these school attacks in particular, but most public space attacks, when you study them, almost without exception, you find that the attackers transmitted their intentions before the attack. They told somebody, sometimes a friend, but usually a trusted adult, a teacher or a parent or somebody. So somebody knew, right? And when you hear that there's a child that's in distress, that's thinking about attacking their school and their fellow classmates, a lot of folks didn't know what to do with that. And so the first thing is just you got to share information. It's okay to tell. It's okay to share that information with a trusted, responsible adult. And then we hope what adults will do is inform the school that there's something going on. But the behavioral threat assessment model in particular is a multidisciplinary approach. So who sits on a behavioral threat assessment team? It's not just law enforcement, although they should be part of it. It's teachers. It's maybe the assistant principal responsible for discipline. It could be and should be counselors that are at the school, any mental health counselors in particular that are there. And the idea is that they all bring some different element of knowledge about the student or about what's going on in their life, or how to interpret the threats, as an example, once a threat's made. And so this multidisciplinary team can actually intervene before, to your point, before something bad happens. And if you catch it early enough, it can be dealt with through counseling, probably, right? If you catch it, in the planning phases, and it's likely a law enforcement, juvenile justice system is going to have to become involved and figure out what's going on. And in some cases, these kids are adults, right? In the case of the Parkland killer, he's an adult. So the criminal justice system is going to get involved. But the idea is the earlier you can catch that and the more well-rounded the team is, the better chance you have in understanding what's actually happened. Is this a real threat? Is there real intent there? And is there a means to carry out the threat? Those are the really important elements that the behavioral threat assessment team uses to determine what action to take.
So we had Andy Pollack, another parent in Parkland, on the podcast maybe about a month ago, and Matthew and I have both read his book, co-authored with our colleague Max Eden from the Manhattan Institute. And just reading through that book, it seemed like there was failures every step of the way that led to the tragedy, even though people, there was information circulating that this incident could happen, and then no one stopped it. How does this new preventative measure improve upon that? What are the specifics? And it seems like there's just more information, and people can actually see like this, that something might happen instead of a bunch of like haphazard ways of getting information that happened in Parkland. Am I getting that right? Or
you are. There were two major themes, I think, in Andy's and Max's book. One is that information. Look, there was a lot of information that was known. This kid was violent from kindergarten, right? We learned that as when we looked back at his academic career, if you want to call it that, in school. I mean, I think his first attack was kindergarten. He attacked another student. So he had behavioral problems that posed a threat to other students his entire career. And that comes out in the book also. So people were aware, right, that he posed a threat to other students. So that's one theme. I think the second theme was information just didn't get shared. And what information then got shared, the third theme is it wasn't acted on. And so everyone knew it was a threat. Nobody was sharing information that could have done anything to prevent the threat. And any information that was in fact shared. So for example, when a parent had contacted the FBI And when a YouTube channel host had contacted the FBI and said, hey, this kid said, I'm going to become the next school shooter. And this was in the comments on one of the YouTube videos. He reported that to the FBI. The FBI sort of handed it over to, they called the local police, but they didn't follow up on it. They didn't make sure that the local sheriff's department took action on that. And then when it came to, and this is why the behavioral threat assessment, the multidisciplinary team is so important. So law enforcement did go out to the killer's home over like 40 times. I mean, I think Max documented like 40 times in the book. And I think we heard similar testimony at the commission. The issue was that when they got there, they didn't believe, or they claimed they didn't believe that that he'd done anything that rose to the level that would require them to arrest him or detain him or do anything like that. So mom made a lot of excuses. He'd attack mom, or he'd destroy property at home. There were accusations that he'd killed the neighbors' animals like chickens and dogs and things like that, which, by the way, Secret Service knows is a precursor. But the law enforcement deputies that went there didn't understand that those were precursor behaviors. Had they brought that information back to behavioral threat assessment team and had a counselor with mental health training, like a psychologist or some training in that, they would have said, "Oh, wait a minute, that's precursor behavior, right?" And he was self-harming, which is also precursor behavior. So those are things that law enforcement didn't know. And had they brought it back to this multidisciplinary team, they could have found out that this kid posed a real threat. And I would like to believe they would have acted differently. And had they done that, we'd have 17 individuals still with us.
Hey, sorry, Corey, do you have something?
I always have something, but go ahead.
So, Ryan, that to me seems like every police department in the country, in the world, should know. Like that's like an easy thing, right? It's a sentence. Harming animals can be a precursor to, to violence. Right. So are you working, or is Walkup working at all with police departments because that seems like a, 2-slide PowerPoint presentation. Like you just email out like, hey guys, police officers in, wherever, all around the country, just know that if you're called out to see someone and you have solid evidence that this kid has been killing his neighbor's animals, there may be a chance that he's going to do something worse, right? So I'm just curious what thoughts are there.
It's a great point. And what we'd like to have happen. So yes, we are working with law enforcement. I've been, last year I spent several months on tour. It kind of sounds funny, on tour with the Secret Service. So we went around the country teaching law enforcement and educators and public policy folks in Chicago, DC, Los Angeles, and then in Miami. We sold out Los Angeles, which was kind of cool to say. We sort of sold out a venue. We had like a couple thousand people in Los Angeles. But the point is, what we want law enforcement to do in that situation is when they see that behavior, they have to say, hey, wait a minute, I need a complete picture of what's going on in the student's life. So yes, that's precursor behavior. Doesn't necessarily mean they're the next school attacker, but what they should do is go to the school and provide that information to a threat assessment team that looks at that and says, oh, wait a minute, you know what? He attacked a student last week with a knife and he's on suspension. So now he's escalated. So what you do is you see what the Secret Service calls is like a pattern or a constellation of disturbing behaviors that is a pathway indicator of potential violence. And then you can act on those things. But the point is to get that complete picture. And then maybe a teacher volunteers that, his head was down at his desk the other day and I asked him what was going on and he said, I just don't want to live anymore, or whatever, right? The idea is to paint a complete picture of the student to know whether or not, where their path is headed. Now, again, this is not, I should point out I won't say again, but I should point out, this is not just for school attackers. This methodology can be used for kids in distress. There may be kids that just are having a bad home life, or they may be being bullied at school, or they may just be depressed over a breakup with a girlfriend or boyfriend or whatever. This kind of model, it doesn't mean you're going to be a school attacker, you get painted with that, or you're entered into the juvenile justice system. It just means these are kids in distress. Let's learn a little bit more about them. Let's figure out what resources can be brought to resolve the problem. And that's really what threat assessment's about. Where it gets political, if we want to get into that, is that this, whenever you use the word like threat assessment or whatever, it sounds very law enforcement related. Right? I try to say behavioral threat assessment, not just threat assessment. And you get groups on the left in particular that look at this and they say, well, if you implement this kind of thing, law enforcement, then law enforcement just wants to arrest kids. That's what they do. They know how to put handcuffs on kids. They want to get them in the juvenile justice system, and they want to reach some quota or whatever. So you hear things like school to prison pipeline talked about, right? But my message for that is, first of all, I don't know any law enforcement officers that like or want to arrest kids or get up in the morning excited to get to their school security role and can't wait to arrest a child. That just, come on, it doesn't happen. Number two, this threat assessment model, again, the earlier you can intervene, the less likely there has to be a law enforcement intervention. The goal is not to put a kid in the juvenile justice system. The goal is not to put a kid into, to arrest a kid. That's not the goal here. The goal is to get them the resources they need. So the earlier we do that, the better outcomes we have, the less likelihood they end up in the criminal justice system. But I will say this, and I think it's important. There are kids that are violent, and there are kids that have intentions to harm other students in those schools. And for every parent, here's the other message coming out of Max's and Andy's book. They're in your kid's school. You don't know it, but they're there. And do you know what policies are in place at your child's school? Do you know, are they trained? Do they understand what the warning signs are and what to look for? And will they act and take appropriate action to make sure your child is safe? The answer, I thought, on February 13th was, yeah, my school's pretty good. It's an A-rated school. That's why we moved there. We bought into that neighborhood. Good zip code, good schools. My kids will be safe. Nothing could have been further from the truth. And when you look at where most of these attacks happen, they happen in, sort of suburban schools in many cases, where parents all thought their kids were safe and the school was a good school. So
you preempted my question. You read my mind. I was going to ask, what's the biggest pushback you get on these types of preemptive proposals? One thing that I could think of is people who don't support these policies could say, this is going to lead to discrimination for certain students, and that could be a problem, is their argument. What do you have a response to that? Is it pretty much what you already summed up, or?
Well, we're in sort of it's an interesting time we're in. What I can say when you look at the facts, let's just take the Parkland tragedy, for instance, and you look at the facts of what happened, and you look what steps were missed that could have been done differently to prevent that tragedy. I think it's worth, I know it's worth the effort. The biggest complaint that we hear is that these kinds of, considering a child a threat is discriminatory. It will be, unequally imposed on students of color in particular. That's really where you hear a lot of the pushback. And then the second thing that you hear is that, well, teachers are teachers. They should just be teaching. They shouldn't have to worry about all this stuff. Well, I agree with that to a point, but the reality is the teachers were targets that day too. And 3 of the staff in Parkland lost their lives because the attacker didn't care whether they were students. The attacker wanted to kill as many people on that campus as possible. So I understand that you'd like your classroom to be this serene place of peace where nothing bad ever happens. But the reality for a lot of our teachers is public school teachers in particular, they're dealing with violent kids on a daily basis. And whether they come to school with the intent to kill other students, they certainly are coming to school with the intent to disrupt class. They're coming to school with the intent to bully other students. They're coming to the school with the intent to hurt their teachers. So behavioral threat assessment is a tool that school districts can use with other partners in the community to protect teachers and students and their staff at these schools. So yeah, I know what your primary mission is. I get it, but we live in the real world and sometimes bad things happen. So if we know a way to prevent them, let's do that.
Yeah, and I think this is another good argument for a system of school choice in unison with these types of safety measures, so that it's possible that there could be some unintended consequences of a school safety measure, but one way to hold the system accountable from the bottom up as well, if there is any of those, and if there are any unintended consequences, is to allow students to vote with their feet to other institutions. If there is some type of discriminatory behavior going on in one particular school, perhaps, then the families should be able to vote with their feet to escape that what they feel to be discriminatory practice. So I think that's another way to solve this argument coming against these types of preemptive measures. I think if we do both at the same time, that's a win-win situation. And Florida has a lot of school choice already.
No, I agree, and I think parents need options and students need options. You need to find an educational environment that works for your student. I think, with the exception of that day, I think Marjory Stoneman Douglas was a pretty decent school. I think, there were good teachers there. Most of the kids were there to learn. And so I think overall it was a pretty good environment, but that was for notwithstanding the tragedy for my kids, that was a judgment my wife and I make, but I don't think it's an ideal situation for every student. And to your point, having choice is definitely important.
Well, and so on that note, real quick, just to, put it right to him, like, let's just talk about what that would have done for the shooter. I mean, if there weren't such rigid, and Max and Andy talk about this in their book, and it doesn't necessarily completely solve the issue per se, legislation creating school choice. That doesn't necessarily fix it, right? Even if that were in place 100%, where it was really policies. It was district policy that pushed him from a program where he was actually doing fairly well. It sounded like he was in a place where his behavior was managed more tightly, his attendance was tracked more closely, so on and so forth. His mental state was tracked more closely. It was, if I recall correctly, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but my recollection is that he was pushed from that environment where he was getting a little more attention and specific to his needs, right? His mental needs. He was pushed from there back into school. Now, he wanted to go, but they were more than happy to push him back too, if I remember correctly. So if there was a system set up that was truly, freedom for the student and for families, it might have been a little easier for them to say, you know what? No, it's not the right move for you now to go back to MSD. It's really probably better for you to move into an intermediate program. You've been doing great here, and we've seen that. So we're going to move you into a potentially less restrictive environment than the one that you're in now, but we're not pushing you back into the general population of the district. So I'm just wondering if there was a more expansive program of school choice, or more options is what I'm really saying, if that would have helped, if that would have met more of his needs, but not put so many people, of course, at risk, as it turned out.
Yeah, I think so. And you mentioned there was a magical term you just used a moment ago, least restrictive environment. So now we're getting into policy.
Right.
So again, this is all stuff I've learned post tragedy, but and I want to be careful how I say this, because this is fraught with landmines, and there's lots of parents on different sides of this issue. But essentially what we've done, and you see Max arguing this quite eloquently, and I won't be able to do it justice. But the way I see it is there are good reasons to have the regulations and laws that we have today governing public schools around, free access to a public education, right? And in the least restrictive environment. There were good intentions behind that. What's happened, which is often the case with legislation at all levels, but particularly the federal level, because it's so far removed from being on the ground, is that we're conflating the idea of taking a child that we would have said was disabled or had a learning disability of some sort. And this is where I want to be very careful about how I say this, is that my intention is not to offend any parents here. My intention is to say the goal of that legislation was to make sure school districts, was to try to hold them accountable, to make sure that every child had an opportunity to get an environment where they could learn and grow. That was try to force it into the public schools, which when you look at the way public schools are structured, you look at it's a factory model, right? It's the Ford Model T factory line. And it works if every car is identical. If every student is as identical as every other student, then it works well. That public model seems to work well, but so many kids fall outside of that. So the legislation was put in place to try to force schools to accommodate students with different ways of learning and different disabilities and whatever. That's great. They try to accommodate it as best they can, but it costs more to do that. And that's going to be important. I'll come back to that. But we also take students that have behavioral issues that aren't there to learn, and we lump them in that same category. And so the system is designed to try to push them back into the least restricted environment, because it's actually the least cost environment for the school district.
Right.
So the cheapest way to educate the kid is to put them back in the factory line and just and deal with it that way, as opposed to putting them in an environment which may be more restrictive. And in the case of the students that have behavioral challenges, should be more restrictive. They should not be, free to roam the halls. They should not be maybe free to wear a backpack. They should not be free. There are restrictions on their behavior. What they found in the case of the killer in Parkland is he actually was, to your point, I'll go as far as saying thriving in that environment. He's doing very well. But we've also put a stigma on that, right? So we've said, well, if you're not in the school you're where your zip code is, then there's something wrong, right? And you're not in the you should be moved back to your public school as quickly as possible. School districts are incentivized financially to do that. And I think they're also, parents want that to happen. So when you say he wanted to move back to Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School, he did. His mom wanted him to move back. His mom thought he was ready for that. And whether she mistook him thriving in this other environment for he's ready to go back or not, we'll never know. But it's like we make as a policy level, we conflate the disability and behavioral problems, and we try to treat them and lump them in the same way. We got to stop doing that as a society.
Just real quick, Matthew, I think the way that Max Eden puts it is that the disparate impact kind of policies, when you apply them to behavioral outcomes, it turns out that they're incentivizing schools to discipline students who misbehave at the same rate as the students who behave well, which just doesn't make any sense at all. I think that's one of the quotes out of the book as well. And I think it's a result, an unintended result of top-down policies like this to incentivize schools to have just work towards this one metric instead of what the metric is actually trying to capture, which is safety.
Well, and then we conflate it even further, and Max, I know, is argued we conflate it with things like school to prison pipeline, which is a term that impacts students of color, or is meant to describe a situation where students of color are more negatively impacted by school discipline, that leads to them being put into the juvenile justice system at a higher rate than other students. But what we don't do is look at the behavior, right? We should define what behaviors are acceptable in the classroom and on campus and which aren't. And regardless of your skin color, regardless of your zip code, regardless of your parents' income levels, we should treat those behaviors in a similar fashion and deal with them. My point in talking about behavioral threat assessment earlier is that there's a way to do that doesn't necessarily mean we're putting kids in jail. That's not the goal. That's not the goal anyone has, including law enforcement. And until we can have an intellectually honest discussion about all of those things, which unfortunately I don't see us having, then I don't see the public schools changing. There are certain things legislatures to do. There's certain things that departments of education can do. We can certainly talk about those to try to enforce that. But right now, so much of the administration of our nation's public schools has bought into this whole notion that they have to treat behavior as a disability and deal with it the same way they do, and then try to make sure that they're disciplining students based on race at the same levels that quite frankly, we're creating environments in our schools where kids are unsafe, teachers are unsafe, and administrators don't like to talk about it.
Well, and I actually agree that there is the possibility of discrimination to occur. I don't know how widespread it is, but it could be really widespread in one particular school, but not a problem in another school. But what's interesting is a lot of the people who say that the policies that you're proposing, Ryan, would lead to discrimination. I'm sure my response would be, yes, that's a possibility, but that's a great argument for school choice, even within the public school system without the policy that you're proposing. There's still the potential for discrimination in the status quo system. And if that's the case, that's a very strong argument to allow students to sort from and to allow those pressures from the bottom up to incentivize all schools to do a good job. But then the people who argue against you in particular tend to not support school choice policies. So I think it's okay to say, you know what, you're right. There's a possibility for this, but we got to support school choice too, to allow for additional accountability.
Yeah, and that's why I say it's hard to have an intellectually honest conversation with the folks that oppose keeping schools safe, I think, or those that I don't even, teachers unions and others and other sort of administrative levels in our school districts. Hard to have that conversation because they don't like choice and they don't want competition. And I do think that as a parent, I should have the right to find the environment where my child has the best opportunity to be successful. That could be in a public school. It could very well be in a public school, but it might be at a private school down the road, or it might be at a charter school. It might be at a pod. It could be in lots of different environments. And I think parents need to be aware of those options and also have the choice to take their students there.
Well, if we're talking logical inconsistencies, there's only opposition to choice when it comes to K through 12 education. When it comes to higher education, a lot of the people who reject funding students directly at K through 12 will support it when it comes to things like Pell Grants and the GI Bill, and then they'll support it with pre-K programs where you can take the money to a public or private provider of pre-K services. But then they get all up in arms when it comes to the in-between years with K through 12, and that's only because the power dynamics differ. The norm with higher ed and pre-K is choice. the norm with K through 12 is an entrenched monopoly that doesn't want you to choose anything else.
And I think we all have, I look back at I'm a product of public schools. I don't, I don't remember the bureaucracy that I see today. And we can talk a little bit more now. I'm on the Florida State Board of Education, so I've got an insider seat at sort of what I see going on. But what I know we've done as I've looked, is we spend more and more, quote unquote, per pupil per year, right? But I don't know that money is actually getting into the classroom and into educating those students. And so one of the roles that I believe I have is, in addition to making sure we're pushing forward with school safety in Florida and not losing ground after we made some progress after the Parkland tragedy, making sure we keep pushing forward on that. But I also sit in that seat, and as I'm asked to vote on different initiatives, I constantly am thinking about what's the best thing for the students. What's the best? That's my primary objective, and I know it frustrates some districts. I know it frustrates superintendents and administrators, and certainly the public school teachers unions in the state probably don't like me very much at all. In fact, I know they don't, but anyway, but that's not my job's not to look after them and protect them. Quite frankly, their job is to look after teachers. And I don't think they're in some cases, doing a particularly good job of protecting the teachers, because they fought against a lot of the school safety reforms that we've asked for. And I have to remind them, their teachers were at the end of that rifle, just like my daughter and all the other students. And so I sometimes it makes me question whether or not they've got the best interests of the teachers at heart. But when I contemplate what we need to do as a state, and I think about it from the perspective of the parents. What is best for our parents here? And what can we do as a State Board of Education to make sure that opportunities and choices are made available to parents across the board? So I'm fortunate enough to be able to sit in that role. And we're doing some good things in Florida, as I think you both know.
So I got to interject really quickly, because there's an intersection between something you just brought up and the topic of today's discussion, between safety and the unions. In Florida earlier this year, at least once that I saw, is probably more than once, the teachers unions filed lawsuits, and they started suing over the reopening of schools in person. You see this happening in other states as well. And so we're talking about safety on this podcast, so we have to address this. You're a school safety advocate. You are also a supporter of school choice. And since you're a school safety advocate, that must mean that you're for fully remote learning. Is that true? That we can't have in person because it's not safe?
Right.
That's what we hear from the groups such as the teachers union. So how do you square that, being a school safety advocate, and if you don't support only remote learning? What's your response?
The answer is simply try to follow the facts in both cases. So what would work to protect a school from a determined attacker? We looked at the science behind the COVID epidemic, and we did actually close schools for a bit last year, and I was involved in that decision. At the time, if you remember, 15 days to slow the spread, a lot of folks said that. It sounded reasonable to me. There was a lot we didn't know at the time, so we didn't know that schools would not be places where a lot of transmission would occur. We didn't know at the time, right? A lot of fear over what was going on with COVID at the time. So we took a step back. We took a look at what some countries like in Germany were doing, where they were keeping in classroom teaching going on. We looked at what was happening in places like Sweden and other places, and we came up over the summer with the idea of, we got to get these kids back in school. The kids need to be back in the classroom. It's particularly important for students that have that are at risk in those high risk categories, more so than the kids that got great internet and, 2 tablets and a laptop and all the other things where they can, and good support systems at home where they can make remote learning work for them. There are a lot of students that don't have that option. And so it became very clear very quickly that we had to get our schools opened. Our governor led on this from day one. Our commissioner of education led on this from day one. And they instituted an executive order basically saying we're opening the schools and asking each of the districts to submit their plans. I think it was back in August when we had to review their plans, but they had to include on campus, in classroom instruction as an option for parents. Again, I think honoring what I said before, which is parents should be the ones making the decision here. And with all the data that we had to make that decision, it was very clear that schools would not be super spreader environments, that kids were at less risk of harm from COVID, and that they weren't, and we learned like from Germany, they weren't bringing it home. And that the infections that were happening were actually, adults that were in the school that were bringing it from outside the school into the school. It wasn't transmitted at, in the school. And so we felt very confident that that would be not only safe, but it was certainly the right thing to do. And I was trying to look at the latest stats before I jumped on here, but we're close to 2 million students, which almost all of our students are back in the classroom in Florida. It's been a phenomenal success. We've only had a handful of cases of transmission. We do contact tracing. We gave very clear instructions to school districts about how to keep the classroom environment safe based on CDC guidelines and Florida Department of Health guidelines and local health department guidelines. So the classrooms are clean. We keep kids in the same classroom as an example, so they're not moving around from classroom to classroom and in the hallway where there's some social distancing in the classroom. So we do that, and it's worked phenomenally well. And those kids that need to be in class are in class and able to learn in an environment that is best suited for most students, right?
Yeah, and what's interesting to point out is Florida is a state that tends to have not as powerful teachers unions as other states like California and New York, for example. And they, from the study that I did with MIT's Christos Makridis, the places that have stronger teachers unions a lot less likely to reopen their schools in person. And we're seeing that play out in Chicago today with the Chicago Teachers Union calling for a 3% test positivity rate threshold as a citywide metric for whether they're even allowed to reopen the schools for in-person instruction.
Which doesn't have anything to do with the students or the schools.
No, I mean, look at New York City. They did this with the 3% threshold as well, like a month or two ago. And even de Blasio and Cuomo are saying we're not seeing spread in the schools, right? That you have a very low percent of positivity in the schools. And the latest data out of New York City that I've seen is that the positivity rate overall in the community is like 6 to 9%, depending on the measure that you use. But in the schools, it's only 0.68%.
Right.
Like a tenth or less as the overall community. And the same data similar data from Brown University's Emily Oster also suggesting that schools aren't super spreaders because of this. The data that we're seeing that the school positivity rate tends to be a lot lower than the overall community positivity
That's
rate.
Right. I think the other thing too, Corey, just to point out is what I've heard, the arguments for keeping the schools closed that are made by administrators, teachers, unions, and politicians typically, and even the media to a certain extent. What they're looking at one side of the equation only. They're looking at the risk of infection, right, or the risk of spreading COVID-19. What they're not thinking about is the achievement gap. They're not thinking about the mental health of the students, that some are in some less than ideal environments on a day-to-day basis. But imagine being months and months and months cooped up at home without, a chance to interact with your peers. You remember, as kids, we're very social people. Kids are very social. They need that interaction. That's how they learn and grow. And to be isolated and relegated to hours and hours of Zoom. I mean, we all get tired of it during the day at work. We're constantly on Zoom calls and whatever. Kids do not thrive in that environment, and we were losing a lot of kids. And so the calculation, my point is the calculation needs to be balanced. You need to look at the risk of infection and spreading COVID, but against the cost to society and these students really of not being in the classroom. And when you weigh those, it's clear the decision is get them back to class, get them back into the classroom, do it safely. It can be done safely, but get them back into the classroom.
I'm going to share a quote from a conclusion of the latest study that I've seen on this. It tries to link school reopenings to COVID hospitalizations. I mean, there's been a lot of other evidence from UNICEF, for example. They looked at data from 191 different countries, finding no consistent link between reopening the schools and the spread of the virus. We've seen case studies from Sweden showing that the schools are not major contributors of the virus there as well, and they've been open the whole time. But here's this new study out of, I think, researchers at the Tulane University, and the quote is, our results suggest that school reopenings have not increased COVID-19 hospitalizations, especially for the 75% of counties that had the lowest baseline hospitalizations, which people may then ask, well, what about the places with very high community transmission? They had no conclusive evidence either way, looking at even the most risky environments
Yeah, usually it's an argument over causation versus correlation, but here there's not even correlation. So yeah, I mean, there's no link at all. There's none. It's safe to you can reopen schools safely, and I would encourage any district or any state that's struggling with the decision, look at the Florida Department of Education website. We've clearly outlined our reopening plan, the principles behind it, and we've got documentation beyond your wildest imaginations about how to do so safely. So use, states are laboratories. Use our, we're a laboratory. We've got, we're the third most populated state. We've got over 2 million kids back in class. Go look at us, use us as an example, use us. You're welcome to call the Department of Education and ask us, how did we do it? If you've got questions about it. But these other states that are on the fence on this, you got to get the kids back. I mean, think about a student that's reading below grade level. It's a risk in that achievement gap. And think about them losing a year, what that means to us, the cost to society of these students not being educated is incalculable, and we're doing a disservice to students and their families by not having schools open.
Well, what's interesting to me is a lot of people will say, oh, well, it's funding. We just need more funding to open the schools. But Florida doesn't spend the most in the nation on schools. I don't even think it's like one of the top states in funding. I think it's below the national average from what I can recall. But then you have places like California where they're still not reopening the schools in so many places, and in New York State that spend a lot more. In DC, where I live, they spend over $31,000 per child per year, and they're still not open. Chicago public schools, they spend $23,000 per child per year, much more than Florida, and they're still kicking and screaming. I mean, they opened for some pre-K students and for some special needs students today, and they're thinking about opening it up to K through 8, but the unions are fighting it still, and
some of them found a way to open up and charge money for daycare, which I just thought I just couldn't believe. We can't open safely, but if you want to drop your kid off and we'll charge you for daycare, well, they could do that.
The same school buildings too, in the same
unbelievable.
That's
unbelievable. That's not putting students first. That's not putting families first, right?
You know what happened there, right? At first I was like, why are they doing this? It doesn't make any sense. And why are they charging families out of pocket? Well, what they did was, teachers, in large part, it doesn't mean they're bad people, they responded to the incentives in front of them, which were, they understood that a lot of them could stay home and continue to be paid the same amount through the property tax system. Mm-hmm. But then a lot of these schools had people from the private sector, the YMCA and other organizations, childcare workers, going into those school buildings, and you got to pay them somehow. So families were paying out of pocket for these additional workers. So then now you got two people doing the job that previously only took one worker to do, and it's all because of the compulsory funding through the property tax system. Now you're essentially have a form of extortion, and families there's in some places are still getting a real bad deal. I think Nashville public schools, for example, most recently tweeted about this, and I quote tweeted like, "Wait, so you're safe enough to reopen for childcare, but not learning? When does that ever make sense?" And it doesn't make sense until you think about all of these different power dynamics at play.
Yeah, well, the incentives, right? Follow the incentives. I had a boss one time that said to me, you have trouble figuring out the behavior. Follow the money, right? Figure out where the money flows, and then you'll understand the behavior better. I just wanted to say, to your point, it wasn't so much about funding. Although I think one of the smart things our governor and our commissioner of education did was to tie funding to getting schools reopened. So you needed to so again, talking about incentives, the incentive then for the districts was to get as many students, back into the classroom as possible. And then that would trigger funding under the emergency order. But there were CARES Act dollars coming from the federal government, like, manna from heaven, I guess, or I don't know what metaphor you want to use. There were plenty of dollars to get schools open for states that wanted to do it. Funding wasn't the issue.
Well, yeah, the CARES Act, $13.2 billion, and then that most recent stimulus, $50 billion for schools. And some places are saying they still need more money to reopen. And the CARES Act funding, I think most states haven't even spent the initial $13.2 billion. I think they haven't even spent half of it yet. And
they couldn't figure out how to spend it fast enough. I mean, that was the problem. They didn't know how to do that. But yeah, funding was not the issue. The issue was one of motivation and really understanding. So coming back to what I said earlier, fundamentally, these institutions should do some soul searching. Why do they exist? They exist to serve the students and the families in those communities, and they've forgotten that. My overarching view of the public education system is they forget who they serve and why they do and why they serve them. And that's not to say the teachers don't, because I think in large part the teachers understand it. They do it for the right reasons. They do it for the students. It's the institutions themselves that have grown administratively beyond what's necessary, to the point where they exist to serve themselves and to hell with the kids, right?
And that's what happens when you have a monopoly, and that's a super important argument for school choice to allow for more competitive pressures to hold particular institutions responsible for their actions. And this isn't to say that every single public school is doing a bad job. There's a lot of public schools doing a good job. There's a lot of public schools doing a great job with remote learning. There are public schools that have reopened in person without fighting too much against that. There are teachers that want to be in the classroom with their students. So this isn't a blanket statement against all public schools or teachers in general. It's that when you have a strong enough monopoly, you have a really perverse incentive to serve the producer rather than the consumer of the service. So I think this would benefit everybody. It would obviously benefit teachers by giving these school systems incentives to spend the additional dollars wisely in the classroom on the teachers.
Yeah.
And I mean, this is really it makes a lot of sense when you look at the response between private sector and the public sector. I mean, the private schools have been open, or they've even been taking it to court to try to reopen. The public schools have been, in so many places, have been fighting for the opposite, not so much in Florida. But yeah, there's a major difference there, and it's one of incentives.
It's incentives, and I'll go one more and say, look, I think it's also leadership, and again, it's remembering why we do what we do. Why do we have public schools? They're there to serve the students and the communities that they exist in. I think our governor and our commissioner of education understand the role they understand their roles, and they understand the roles of the schools that they play in the community. And so leadership is another important factor here. And I think they were willing to go to battle. We were sued. The Department of Education was sued by the teachers unions in the state of Florida when they put out the executive order. We won that lawsuit. We prevailed in that. The schools opened up. But it takes a certain it takes leadership. It takes leadership.
And on that, one of the biggest and most optimistic news in 2020 was that DeSantis signed a bill to expand school choice in the state by, I think, like 25,000 students each year, or even more. And school choice advocacy groups were calling that the biggest expansion of private school choice initiative ever in U.S. history. So Florida's the place to look. I mean, it's one of the top, or if not it's one of the top or the top state when it comes to educational freedom. So everybody can learn a lot from your state, Ryan.
I 100% agree with that, and I'm glad to see we're adding more options. I know the demand is outstripping the supply at this point, but a lot of those initiatives go to a comment you made earlier, which is they really allow parents to take that funding and find a school that their child fits in. And their scholarship programs. We do something really interesting here too, which I think you both understand, but corporations in Florida can assign their tax revenues over to these private scholarship funds, or they're administered by private entities. And then they go to fund scholarships for students that are in neighborhoods with really bad schools. And it's a chance for those kids to get out of those bad public school situations and into what is almost always a private school, right? A private school that will give them an opportunity to get the education they can't get in their neighborhood school. So I'm proud of what we're doing there. And I think, as more and more families realize there's an opportunity there, again, the demand is just outstripping the supply. It's just, there are more kids that want to participate than they couldn't. So that's why, that's why I think our governor is expanding that. So.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ryan. We've passed the hour mark, but I just want to thank you again so much for coming out and talking to us today. I'm sure we could go on for another couple of hours, but we'll have to have you back on. I want to thank all of the listeners for tuning in to another episode of the Educational Freedom Institute podcast.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Thanks.